long time no see. I want to start out by working through 3 different theories, as I talked about, understanding how the minimum wage is going to affect employment using 3 models. The first model we want to think about is the neoclassical model of the labor market. So we're going to think about a situation where labor markets are perfectly competitive, right? You have supply and demand that are equal to each other in equilibrium, and all workers and firms care about is wages. So there's no non-wage amenities to think about. So this is going to be a very straightforward, very comfortable set of models, right? So as we expect, we can lay out with number of workers on the horizontal axis, wage on the vertical axis, right? We're going to have a downward sloping labor demand curve. We're going to have an upward sloping labor supply curve. And in the absence of a minimum wage, right, when we allow the market to attain equilibrium, we're going to have an employment level where supply equals demand, and that's going to occur at some wage W star, right, at which supply equals demand. So in this situation, we know that demand equals supply. We know that we're in economically efficient outcome, and we know that the returns to workers are going to be given by this area here, right, the producer surplus, and the returns to employers are going to be given here. That's going to be the consumer surplus, right? Producer surplus and the consumer surplus. Okay. Now, when we put a minimum wage in place, the predictions of this model are going to be pretty unambiguous for the effect on employment. The reason for that is, if we set some minimum wage above this equilibrium wage, it has to be the case that at this new higher wage, there's more workers willing to work, right? In other words, the amount of labor supplied at this wage is higher than at L star, but there's fewer employers willing to hire, right? The amount of labor demanded has to be below L star. And because of the fact that labor supply and labor demand were equal at W star, it has to be the case that when labor demand goes down, labor supply goes up, that labor demanded is going to be the limiting factor, right? That determines the number of workers that we're actually going to see employed. So what's the conclusion here? Employment must fall because labor demand is downward sloping. If we want to think about what's going to happen to the producer surplus and the consumer surplus, this is going to boil down to the amount that labor demand is going to fall relative to the increase in wages, right? So if we think about this from the perspective of workers, right, we think about this from the perspective of producers are gaining and they're also losing. So what producers are losing is this triangle here of deadweight loss. That's the deadweight loss from the producers, right? Of course, there's also going to be a deadweight loss that comes out of consumers of labor, right? So workers are going to be losing because of the decreased employment, but they're going to be gaining because they're going to capture this big chunk of what used to be consumer surplus, right? In other words, the workers who continue to be employed are going to have higher wages than they did before. On top of this, if we want to think about the degree to which employment is going to go down, right? So this model is unambiguous that employment is going to fall. It doesn't tell us how much employment is going to fall. And the answer to that is going to have to depend on how elastic demand for labor is. So if we think about a situation with highly elastic labor demand, we're going to have a labor demand curve that looks pretty flat, right? And what that means is you change wages just a little bit, you're going to change employment, labor demanded by a lot. We'll have labor supply look however we want. So if we go from our equilibrium wage, W star, L star, to some slightly higher minimum wage, right, we're going to see a very large decrease in labor demanded, and that very large decrease in labor demanded is going to determine the fall in employment, right? We don't really care about the elasticity of labor supply because we know that there's going to be more labor supplied than labor demanded when we have an effective minimum wage. On the other hand, If we had a highly inelastic labor demand curve, we would expect to see that that same change in minimum wage might not have very much effect on labor demanded at all. Right? So now we've got a highly inelastic labor demand curve. Right? The employment level does not change very much when the wage changes. And if we take this same minimum wage and apply it here, we're going to see that the amount of labor demanded hardly changes at all. And so as a result, when we're working in a competitive model, all we need to know to evaluate the effect on workers of a change in minimum wage is to know how elastic labor demand is, right? When labor demand is highly elastic, a minimum wage is going to have serious negative consequences for workers. When labor demand is highly inelastic, the negative consequences for workers are not going to be very serious compared to the size of the wage gains.